evening, everyone. Thank you for being with us tonight. I also want to thank our sponsor, Wells Fargo Advisors. Nina Brady, Kevin Loki, Mary Moore are joined tonight by Tim Brisket. Is that Brisket? Maybe you'd like to stand? Sure. Everybody? Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Tim's our complex manager of Savannah.
Yeah, so we need to impress him so he'll continue to run this program. I hope you enjoyed our first lecture last week. Tonight we move from the local to the international. Our speaker has since childhood been a lover of museums. At an early age, she began visiting the Alaska State Museum, where she encountered a magnificent object that would have a major impact on her life. At the museum, Teresa Leavitt saw a Fresnel lens for the first time and soon became aware of the global significance of this 19th century French invention. She would later become an historian of optics, receiving a bachelor's degree in physics from MIT, a master's of history from Iowa State University, and a PhD from Harvard University. She is now Associate Professor of History at the University of Mississippi. She was the recipient of a National Science Foundation grant and a Fulbright Institute of International Education Fellowship, among other honors. In addition to writing numerous articles and papers, she's written a fascinating book about the invention of the Fresnel lens and its intriguing journey to American lighthouses. Bob West of the Coast Guard Auxiliary, a loyal friend to the Society, brought this book to my attention. As soon as I read it, I realized we should invite Teresa to St. Simon's so that we could learn more about the magnificent lens at the top of our lighthouse. So thank you, Teresa, for accepting our invitation. If you're interested, signed copies of her book, A Short Bright Flash, are available in the museum store. And for those of you who enjoy listening to books, it can be downloaded from Audible and gets 4.7 out of 5 stars. Also, you also need to buy the book as well because the illustrations are so interesting. So thank you again, Teresa, and I hope you enjoy your stay on St. Simon's.
Well, thank you, Mimi. That was very kind. I also want to thank everybody for coming out. Everybody gets extra points for coming out in the rain. And I want to thank you for inviting me here. This is an island of just unearthly beauty. I've enjoyed it so much, and it's just a rare treat to be able to go and see one of these original Fresnel lenses actually operating. There aren't that many left anymore, and it's a really sort of exceptional lighthouse that you have here. So what I wanted to talk about today, so you can see I'm framing the talk with this question: why did the Yankees want the St. Simon lens? And they did very much. People don't often think about lighthouses during the Civil War. They think perhaps even less about these lighthouse lenses. But in fact, they were an object of extreme interest to the Union Army. And a lot of the early naval work was, in many ways, about trying to get them back. So what I wanted to do was sort of start out talking a little bit about what was going on here during the Civil War, and I suspect many of you may know more than I do about that. But what I also wanted to do was sort of put that in a context which explains it. Put it in a context which explains why these lenses would have been so interesting at this period of time. So we'll start out with the Declaration of War. So the first act of the Civil War by Lincoln was to declare a blockade on the southern coast. And the first act, the first retaliation by the Confederate States of America was to extinguish all of the lights along the coastline, leaving it perfectly dark. Lincoln formed what was called the, let's see, it's not working. We actually did a test run in which it was working. I was told I need to slide it over. I forgot about that. I forgot about that little part. There we go. So he declares a blockade. As I said, the first thing of the Civil War is the declaration of this blockade. He puts the Atlantic blockade under the direction of a man named Samuel DuPont, who who, in fact, was one of the key figures that had been responsible for introducing these Fresnel lenses into the United States in the first place. And so the very first thing that they have to do, actually, their first target is Cape Hatteras. They want to control it so that they're able to relight the lighthouse. It's an extremely dangerous spot, as many of you probably know, and the Union Navy was, in fact, over the course of the Civil War, they actually lost more ships to grounding accidents than they did to naval warfare. So the fact that they no longer had any navigation guides was a matter of extreme urgency to them. So the Hatteras Lighthouse was their very first target. They were able to sort of acquire it, and the lens had been removed, but they put up sort of lanterns in it next. And the second step after that, DuPont wanted to establish a base at Port Royal, and then he sort of moved down the coastline, trying to ascertain the status of the various lighthouses that you have. I have the major ones marked on here. And generally what he found out is that the situation was not very good. The best case scenario was that the lighthouse keepers had removed the lenses and then hidden them somewhere. Often they sort of sent them inland, or they may have sort of buried them in a swamp nearby. But there are also a lot of worst case scenarios as well, where they arrived and they found that just everything had been destroyed. Sort of the glass prisms had been broken with hammers and lay scattered around the floor. The towers had been burned. And in some cases, I'll give the example of Tybee Island. They arrived there. The lens was missing, but the tower was actually in reasonably good shape, so they took control of it. They put a lantern up to serve as a temporary guide. But about a month after that, there had been a Confederate raiding party that had snuck in at night, and they had a keg full of powder that they lit off, and the tower as well burned down, rendering it unusable. So I'll go back here. So St. Simon's was one of the ones he was interested in, and as you probably know, there was an encampment of Confederate soldiers right on the island, which made it difficult for him to sort of stop and see what was going on. But he heard rumors. He had heard rumors of what had been happening. Some of it he got from the lighthouse keeper of Little Cumberland Island, which is just a bit to the south. What I have a few, I pulled out a few of these letters. These are the naval documents that DuPont is writing back and forth with the Secretary of the Navy up in Washington, the head of the Lighthouse Board. I won't necessarily read them through, but just if you get bored of hearing me talking, you can read it yourself. But what he's saying here is that he had, they'd gone down to St. Andrew's Sound, and then they'd seen sort of somebody rowing out to them in a rowboat. And what it was the lighthouse keeper, who in fact was a Union sympathizer, so he's effectively sort of throwing himself into the protection of the Union. And he told them that he had been ordered to dismantle his lens, and then he sent it to Brunswick, and that he also believed that the St. Simon lens had also been dismantled at this time and also sent to Brunswick. And furthermore, that the lighthouse tower had been burned and destroyed. So about the same time, they are also hearing rumors that the Confederate troops on St. Simon's Island had moved off, so that it was now they could now enter without any danger. So he sends an expedition. One of the things I find interesting about this is that you can see the sort of primary goal of this expedition is, in fact, to recuperate the lenses of these two lighthouses so that they could be reinstalled. So they head then to Brunswick. Just a description of what happens. So they're moving into Brunswick. It's deserted. Everybody all the inhabitants of the town have fled. They've sort of taken all their valuable possessions and fled. Sort of as they're moving in, they see sort of a fire on the docks. The sort of fleeing townspeople had sort of set fire as they left. They scour the town for the lenses. They can't find them anywhere, and so they leave. But as they're leaving, they leave behind these notices. So they put up posters everywhere where they're going, which make it clear that they're not there to do looting. They're not there to take anybody's private property. They're going to respect all the laws of private property. But at the same time, they really want those lenses back. The people should really return these lenses. And this is actually something that you see everywhere along the southern coast, is that the blockading squadron doesn't have a lot of luck locating these lenses, but they make it very clear that this is property that belongs to the United States government, and they're going to do whatever necessary it is to get it back, while at the same time also making clear that they're going to leave alone any property that doesn't belong to the US government. These lenses, they're enormously expensive, and they're enormously important. And they were part, this was a war that was being fought, of course, over this issue of both the assertion and the refusal of federal power. So the US government had installed these lenses. The Confederate States now claimed them as their own. And in some cases, this sort of cut to the heart of what the disagreement was about. There were other pieces of federal property. Forts, I think, are one of the things that people often focus on. But unlike forts, lenses are something that can be sort of dismantled and packed away. And so they become one of the things that, that they really focus on in their efforts to get back. So now I want to come to this why portion. How did we come to this historical moment where this lighthouse technology played the particular role that it does? And for this, I want to back up. I want to back up and talk a bit more broadly about sort of the history of lighthouses in general. We'll go all the way back to the classical period. So people think about lighthouses as one of the most ancient forms of technology that exist. If you think about the 7 wonders of the world, the 7 wonders of the ancient world that existed, you have the lighthouse at Alexandria, Egypt, Pharos, and then also there's actually another one that's a lighthouse. The Colossus of Rhodes is thought that, it's this big statue standing over the harbor, and it's thought that actually the point of it had been that it was holding up a light at the top. So you do see these very ancient lighthouses. The trick, you might notice that I put quotation marks around the word lighthouse, and the reason is both because they don't actually use the word lighthouse. You don't really see a regular use of the word lighthouse until the 18th century. So these were usually called beacons, which is the same word that you would have used for, sort of some sort of navigational marker, which also did not have a light on it. And the other trick is that they don't really fill the function that we sort of most readily think of a lighthouse as fulfilling. Now we think of a lighthouse as something which is, you have it on the coast and it's going to warn you away from a dangerous spot. But that's actually a sort of fairly recent role for it. In the ancient world, for the next few thousand years after, generally what it did is it marked a harbor. So we have an illustration here. This is somebody's sort of fanciful idea. Nobody's entirely sure of exactly what the Pharos looked like. But what we do know is that it was located right at the entrance to the harbor in Alexandria, Egypt. And this is where you tended to find all of these beacons, as really a point of sort of marking the spot that ships would have already been looking for to try to enter into a harbor. So you have these, like from the ancient world. The Romans build them. You'll see medieval lighthouses and such. It's not until the 18th century, though, that you begin to get a real sort of change in the roles. So you get some changes. So they start out, usually they're simply like wood fires. You begin to get the use of more coal fires. In the 17th century, people begin using more candles. And really throughout most of the 18th century, that remains sort of the highest technology that you have. I mean, what is most lighthouses? They're sort of candles stuck in a high window or a tower. But in the 1780s, you begin to get a couple of developments that usually go together. And this is the use of oil lamps. See, this is a typical oil lamp at the time. So this would be the canister holding the oil. It would go down here, and then the flame would be contained within a sort of glass tube. And then what they placed behind these lamps was what they called a parabolic mirror. So it would be made out of metal. It would be what was called speculum metal, which was sort of as shiny as they could get it. And it would be beaten into a curve in the shape of a parabola. And the idea here is that you have your flame producing light, and the light's going on in all the different directions. And under normal circumstances, a lot of the light would be lost and wasted. The light going behind you, the light going in front. But here, if you have the mirror, you can actually bend those rays of light, and it'll all go out in a single beam, and it will be much brighter than it would have been otherwise. And it was. This was a decided improvement over just the sort of naked flames that they had previously. And so here is the moment when you begin to get really the first attempts at going beyond simply the harbor lights meant to mark the entrance to a harbor, and things that are more sort of ambitious in terms of trying to keep ships safe, keep ships away from dangerous areas. The original St. Simon's Light was built in this context. It was, if I remember, so 1811, and it was built with these oil lamps and mirrors. As I said, so it's a decided improvement. In some way, it's maybe 10 times brighter than what you could get with a naked flame. The trick is that it wasn't yet quite bright enough. For example, Cape Hatteras also puts up its first lighthouse at this moment with an oil lamp and mirror arrangement. But what you get soon after is that the word goes out. In fact, on the sort of coast survey that all the sailors read as they're navigating the coast, it actually has a line that says, "Do not try to navigate by this light. Do not go looking for this light, because by the time you see it, you're already going to be sort of in the shoals." So, because they stretched about 10 miles out, and it really could only be reliably seen, sort of 8 miles on one of the good days. So they still weren't quite there. The big change came in the 1820s due to the work of a man named Augustin Fresnel. So he was a French civil engineer. He was also one of France's great scientific minds, but sort of his job description was as his title was ordinary engineer in the Civil Engineering Corps. And he was called to Paris. Actually, he was called to Paris in order to sort of test the relative brightness of some of these parabolic mirrors. They were better than anything they had before, but at the same time, they weren't quite satisfactory. So he was called to try to see what sort of improvements could be made. And the suggestion that he had was to get rid of these mirrors entirely. He said there are some sort of fundamental disadvantages that you have. For one, the metal that they were using wasn't that reflective. It lost about half of the light, just sort of at the moment of reflection, and they became tarnished very easily, which meant sort of people were constantly out there trying to polish them. But once you polish them, you could sort of rub off the shiny layer as well. And you can see there's sort of a problem with the arrangement. In order for the oil lamp to go through, you had to have a hole in the bottom, and you sort of lost a certain amount of light that way. So he said there are problems with this design that can't be fixed. And so he said what you should use instead are glass lenses. So you can see the mirror. What the mirror does is it reflects these rays of light in order to all send them out in one direction. But you could also do the same thing if you had them refract through a prism. Now, he wasn't actually the first person who thought of this, but there'd been a long list of objections to this. For one thing, if you had a prism, the kind of prism you would need, it would have to be enormous, and it would have to be sort of nearly free of flaws, and they just weren't capable of producing that kind of glass and sort of those sizes. Also, you needed to really bend the rays of light a lot, which meant you really needed a very steep curvature, which meant that the lens would have to be really thick in the middle, which meant that you would lose a lot of light going through it. So there were all sorts of objections to this, but he had another suggestion, and that was this idea building the lens in what he called by steps. This is actually the original illustration that he submitted to the Lighthouse Commission to try to explain his idea to them. So here's a lens. Here's the kind of lens that would, sort of take a bunch of light going out in lots of directions and bend it all into a single beam. And he said, what you could do is sort of divide it into these different steps, and then you could just cut out the entire middle part. All you really needed were these sort of curved sections at the end. And if you just got rid of the entirety of the bulk in the middle, it would still be able to bend the light in such a way that you get all of the light from a light source going out in one single direction. So he showed this to the Lighthouse Commission, and they said, actually, they weren't necessarily very enthusiastic at the beginning. They said, it's like, well, we don't really see your point, but look, if you're willing to make one of these, we're willing to look at it. So he went home. He actually made one out of his own pocket. It wound up working pretty well. And so they then gave him a bunch of money to make sort of the first actual lens that would go in a lighthouse. And here it is. It's Le Chautauqua in France. It's often called, it has the nickname the Versailles of the Sea, and if you go inside, there are like marble fireplaces and sort of gilt ornamentation, and it was actually designed for like the King of France to go visit, though I don't think he actually made it out there. But at any rate, the sort of truly sort of crowning achievement of it was this lens. You can see it has these middle panels, and these middle panels, I mean, they look like they're almost flat. And yet they're achieving the same effect as you would if you had sort of a huge, sort of very convex lens there. Now, the top and the bottom probably look pretty strange. If you've seen a lot of lighthouse lenses, this probably looks pretty weird to you. And that's because really only the middle part is actually a lens. Both the top and the bottom still consist of mirrors. And the trick is that, you can only bend light so far. And so only really sort of the middle portion of the light was able to be bent enough to get into this beam, and then the rest still had to be sort of reflected by mirrors. But Fresnel had an idea. He sort of never stopped dreaming. He said that he had a solution to that problem. And this was, it's actually a little weird optical trick that happens. If you have a prism, and you shine light in it, and you shine it at a steep enough angle, what you're able to do is that the light actually does not sort of go out again the way that you would expect it to. It actually bounces back in. It's called internal reflection. And he said, what you can do is you can build little prisms that have sort of the precise geometry such that the light's shining in, it's being reflected internally, and then going back out another surface. So effectively, what this means is that these glass lenses can act like a mirror. But the good part about them is that unlike the mirrors they were using at the time, which lost half of their light on this point of reflection, this lost virtually no light whatsoever. So he said, so he had sort of an updated design, where here is sort of the middle part that we saw earlier, and then above and below you had these internally reflective prisms, which could, sort of capture the rest of the light and sort of bend it on these very, very sharp, through these very sharp angles. All right, so this then is sort of the basis of his design. What do I have here? Oh, this is what and this is what it sort of looked like in their finished work. So this would be a revolving one. So as it turned around, the light there would be sort of several different beams, and the light would all focus around sort of a single beam, and so it sort of flash as you're watching it. This would be a fixed one, so it would send out one sort of steady beam. So this, of course, if you've been able to see the lens, is what the St. Simon one looks like, but it has what's called flash panels, which will go around and make it look as if it's flashing, which will give it a sort of unique signature so that you don't get confused about where you are, and you know exactly where you are when you see it. All right, so this then is essentially the moment when lighthouses become sort of reliable for the first time. This really sort of puts it over the edge where previously, as I said, you may or may not have seen the Cape Hatteras light from 8 miles away. This light could very easily be seen from, until the only limitation on it was when the beam was cut off by the curvature of the Earth. And this depended on, how high up you were when you were observing it, but it was, it could be up to 40 miles. Some people report seeing these at 40 miles. Of course, you have to be really high up to do that. Usually it's about 20 miles. 20 miles away is when ships would be able to see it. But this is sort of like the tipping point moment when it becomes far enough that it can become a very reliable and effective navigation aid for warning you away from dangerous spots. All right, so this then is the start of what you call sort of the lighthouse revolution. This is really when lighthouses switch from just being these sort of harbor lights to being these great seacoast lights that we think of. And this is also when most of them begin to be built. You go from, I think that France had, 7 lighthouses when Fresnel was working on this, and they immediately came up with a plan to build sort of 43 once you develop this. The United States similarly had, I think, on the order of like 10 lighthouses when it declared its independence from England, and then it very quickly comes up with plans to have many, many more. Although I should say the United States was very, very slow to join the lighthouse revolution. So this is developed, as we saw, in the 1820s. The 1830s is when you begin to see a lot of the European nations are putting these in effect. And the person in charge of lighthouses in the United States hears about this, and he writes a letter to France. So the person in charge, I should say, he's known as the fifth auditor. So he's the auditor of the Treasury Department. So he's the person that effectively keeps the accounting books for the Treasury Department. And this is because sort of taking care of lighthouses was not necessarily anybody's full-time job. As I said, there are only about 10 of them when the Constitution gets written, so they don't necessarily bother assigning that job to anybody. So his job is to keep the accounts of the Treasury Department and make sure that nobody's spending too much money on anything, which is not really what you want with the person protecting your coast. He writes to France, and he asks sort of the big question in his mind is like, how much do these things cost? He gets an answer back, and the answer is effectively a lot. They cost about 3 times as much as the most expensive apparatus that they're currently using. So the most expensive sort of set of mirrors, of parabolic mirrors that they have. So his response is like, well, we can do it for much cheaper. Of course, the apparatus that he was using was not particularly effective, but in fact, he did not spend a lot of time at sea. In fact, he really didn't go out to sea at all. So that was not his primary concern. And what happens? You have a period of American sailors sort of gradually realizing that the lighthouses in other countries are in fact much better than theirs. So you see these sort of increasing tide of complaints. And what effectively happens by the 1850s is you get, it almost amounts to a sort of coup by these engineers, these sort of scientifically trained engineers who sort of rise up and wrest control away from the auditor of the Treasury. And you see in the foundation, in 1852, the foundation of the United States Lighthouse Board, which really had sort of was created almost on sort of a single platform of trying to get these lenses introduced into the United States. So what happens then, it's in 1952 that they launched just an enormous project of both equipping all of the existing lighthouses with these lenses and also building a bunch of new ones as well. It's a massive project. It costs millions of dollars. There are effectively only 2 companies that make these lenses. Both of them are in France. And they start essentially working full-time for the Americans. Every single thing that's coming out of their shop is being shipped over to the United States. And it still takes a really long time. St. Simon's got its lens in 1856, which is right about in the middle of the outfitting. The project is really not, in fact, completed until 1859, which you can see does not leave them necessarily a lot of time to enjoy these lenses before the Civil War breaks out. I mean, just a couple more words. So you can see that, so the lenses come in three, they're called, what are often called orders. So the first order being the largest, down to the sixth order. And usually how it is anything sort of third order and above is considered a seacoast light. It's one of these lights which is really going to sort of be one of the first things that you see as you're approaching from the ocean. And then the smaller ones would be the harbor lights, which would sort of guide you once you're already entering into the harbor. So the St. Simon's one is a third order, which is sort of pretty typical. In fact, when Fresnel was originally coming up with this, he sort of specified that this was the order of light that would be sort of most appropriate for using at the entrance to bays and sounds, where it doesn't necessarily need to be seen 40 miles away, but you still need something that's fairly bright for this. Just a word, I mean, these things were really sort of marvels of engineering and craftsmanship. I mean, one of the difficulties of trying to get through this massive order filled was that these weren't really sort of assembly line manufacture. The demands for the glass had to be very, very high. In fact, Fresnel wound up going through several different glass manufacturers. And in the end, the only glass manufacturer that he really was satisfied with was the one Saint-Gobain, which before the French Revolution had been essentially the royal manufacturer that had supplied the kings of France with all of the glass for example, the Palace of Versailles. If you've ever been at Versailles, you know that there's a lot of glass, and the Hall of Mirrors is essentially covered with mirrors. And the manufacturer that had made those was essentially the only one capable of making glass of a high enough quality to be able to fulfill the orders that he had. And also, there were really sort of extraordinary demands for precision at the time. I mean, this is coming at a moment really in sort of the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, where manufacturing had not really sort of entered a level where being worried about sort of 1/100th of a millimeter was particularly important to anyone. So when he starts making it, when Fresnel first starts working, he partners with a man who actually at this time had a really long established reputation as France's sort of premier scientific instrument maker. And sort of that's the level of precision that they continue to work with. So you have sort of extraordinary demands for quality, extraordinary demands for precision, and it means that these wind up being some of the most sort of expensive and in some ways technically exquisite objects of their day. So the most advanced technology, really, of their day. All right, so let me return then to the question. So why did the Yankees want the St. Simon's lens? Well, you can surely sort of see why they would have wanted something that was so expensive and had been so hard to get. Also, clearly, it was something that was going to aid in the war effort. It was going to sort of keep these ships, which were in fact grounding themselves off of the shore. It was also, this was federal property. It was in some ways the most sort of tangible example of federal property that they had to fight over at the time. But I also want to add another sort of layer of context to all of this. So it comes at a particular historical moment as well in the middle of the 19th century. It was one of the first massive, sort of truly federal public works programs. It's also coming at this moment. The United States had just doubled its coastline, effectively. You have Florida and Texas are added as states in 1845. You have the acquisition of the Oregon Territory in 1846. You have California added in 1848. So one of the reasons this project that begins in 1852 is so massive is because it's also equipping all this coastline, which had been thoroughly empty to that point. And you can see, as part of the mentality of doing that, is that they are sort of making a nation out of all of this. They're taking all of these pieces that had just been put together, and they're making a nation of them. It's an effort of really establishing of national unity. Sort of think of it as like this exclamation point on manifest destiny. The idea, particularly with some of these Western ones, of claiming, this is territory that belongs to us. We've claimed it with our lighthouses. So another layer of the context in all of this is that it's in the service of this project of national unity. The Civil War clearly presents a challenge to the idea of national unity. It's a challenge that continued long after the Civil War itself had ended. But once you get to the end of the Civil War, you see that lighthouses are once again sort of being recruited into the project of binding everything together again. As soon as the war ends, you have an effort to recuperate the lenses that they can find, and they wind up finding a lot. One of my sort of favorite stories is in North Carolina. The troops march into Raleigh, and they march into the sort of state capitol building, and they find these sort of huge boxes like littering the floor. These boxes that are raised sort of taller than someone's head, and they have no idea what they are. They finally wind up opening them, and it's all of the sort of lenses from the coast that had been sort of just sitting on the Capitol floor for storage. They dig a lot up out of sort of people's farms, people's swamps. I was talking with Mimi, and neither one of us have been able to figure out what actually happened to the ones that have been shipped to Brunswick. They may very well. Things got a little confused at this time. They may very well have, sort of been sent up to New York. Typically, the sort of all the broken ones got sent up to New York. They were sort of fixed up and tried to be sent back. It may not have. I don't know either. At any rate, so what had happened immediately after the Civil War, there becomes another sort of huge project of trying to light everything back up. And you get, as you can see, sort of in 1867, not long after, the money is apportioned to try to rebuild the St. Simon's Lighthouse, and it ultimately gets constructed in 1872. So to end on this note then, so the idea of national unity, even in the wake of the Civil War, you can't find a lot of sort of hopeful shoots for it, but Fresnel lenses, I believe, can count for that. Thank you so much. I'll take any questions you have. Yes. They continued using oil lamps for a long time. It was well into the 20th century that they switched over to electricity. Yes.
If I'm a captain of a ship and I see a lighthouse, a light, how do I know if that's a light telling me to stay away or to come in? What is the legend? Was there a legend?
Yes. They had, all the captains would have, there would be a guide which would tell you what the sort of signature lighthouses were. So this is the reason that you would have a revolving light. So it was a light that would go, it would turn at a certain point, and you'd see a flash, and sometimes once every 15 seconds, sometimes once every 30 seconds, and they would try to position them so that you didn't have, you never had two fixed lenses right next to each other. You didn't have two revolving lights with the same signature. And then, as a ship pilot, you would have in your hand something telling you which lights belong to which place. So it was used both as a way, to tell you there's the shore, but also to tell you exactly where you were.
And the conditions, I guess, and whether it was a harbor there. Or
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
How many other lighthouses have this particular lens?
Well, in the 19th century, sort of all of them, eventually, sort of every single lighthouse would have one of these. I mean, it was, if you didn't have one of these, then, it was hard. Because actually, even the trick is that I'm talking about how expensive they were. These are enormously expensive. But even if you had one of these, you could have, it'd be about this big, and it would be as effective as, one of these sort of complicated mirror apparatuses. So even with the smaller one, you could actually wind up saving some money on it. So, I talked about how hesitant they were because they were expensive. But, even if you weren't willing to, pitch in the money for a really big one, you could actually wind up saving money in the oil that you burned with a small one. So the question is, sort of how many ultimately have them? They all did. If the question is how many have them now, that's a much smaller number. I mean, I was sort of expressing my appreciation for being able to actually go up and sort of see the lens working. And I think it's, sort of a really, a really special thing to be able to, go out and see the light of this every night. There aren't that many that still have their original lens operating and shining every night. See back here. And then, yeah. Yes.
Back in the Civil War day and then today, were the lenses at our St. Simon's Lighthouse, were they of first order or one of the other ones?
They were third. I think the original one was third, and I think it's still a third. As I said, these are sort of one of the preferred ones if you're in a bay and you're not necessarily trying to warm ships that are sort of coming all the way across the ocean. You're more sort of marking this entrance. The third order was generally what was recommended.
And would Hatteras have the first order?
Yes. So Hatteras in fact got the very first order lens that the United States ordered from France. Yes.
I have a personal love affection for this lighthouse. In 1989, I was coming back from British Columbia from the World Games competing, and I was flying out of Jax on a small airplane, which is McGraw Airlines. And we were up there, and we were rocking and rolling in thunderstorms, and my wife was waiting for me down at the airport, and Ronnie McCluskey was on the radio, and the pilot calls out, "We're lost." And we're bouncing around, and I'm holding on to both sides. I didn't hear that. But we're bouncing around, and all of a sudden he drops it down, and he drops it down again, and he saw the lighthouse. And he back that plane down, wham, and it came down, and I got out of there, and I kissed that tarmac. My wife told me, he said that the pilot said that they were lost. We kept coming down, and that lighthouse saved my life.
Yes, well, I love that story. This is one of the things. I mean, I love going and visiting lighthouses. I mean, I find them they're always in gorgeous locations, and then they're just such iconic things themselves. But I mean, I think in this day and age, what sometimes gets a little bit lost is just the fact that they saved a lot of lives. Yeah, they really did. Yes.
What size lens do we have currently out here?
I think it's still currently a third order as well. So they, and I think, I mean, this is not my picture, but that should be the one up there. And yeah, and this one, it's both. I mean, it has this really interesting configuration where it's both one of these fixed. This is not a fixed lens, But it's both one of these fixed lenses here, and then, as you can see, it has sort of these additional panels going around, which will create a sort of flashing effect to help distinguish it in particular. You see all the way in the back.
Is it true that the formula was lost as to how Fresnel did this in these glasses?
No, I hadn't heard this. I mean, part of the trick is that Fresnel, it's really quite a tragic story in his life. He died sort of fairly young. So he died, as I said, he had this sort of dream of, doing this like sort of second level, and he had worked everything out. He didn't actually live to be able to see the completion of it. But his brother sort of picked up the project and continued it, and I think his brother actually sort of retained a lot of the work that he had done. Let's see, where I think.
What sort of lenses replace the Fresnel?
Well, there are no better lenses. I mean, there's no sort of technology which is going to produce a brighter beam. I think the big thing now is that sort of GPS is sort of the standard of navigation, and I think that now the ones that no longer have the original lens use these sort of beacons in which just the source of light is so bright. I mean, it's essentially, sort of an electric bulb which is so bright that it doesn't need the sort of magnifying that you get with a lens. See a question over here?
Do you know what our viewable distance is based for the curvature of the Earth?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I don't.
What we say, which is supposedly right, is the fixed light is 17 miles. The flash itself is 23.
Yeah. That's a very visible light. And you can see, like, sort of the third order. It's not even the biggest order, and yet it was brighter than sort of any light that they had before the 1850s. Any more? Yes.
What are the dimensions of the third?
Good question. Let's see. So it depends a bit. These. First orders, these can get to be 10 feet tall, often like 8 to 10 feet tall. What would you guess the third order is?
It's around 5.
5. Yeah, they're big. Yeah, you can go inside some of these big ones. They're actually, there's also another level in the 1880s. They started producing something known as a hyperradial lens, which was even sort of bigger than this, which was about I think they could be up to like 12 to 14 feet tall. And in that case, they would actually have like little chairs inside, like the light keeper could go and like set up the little office inside. And you can see, and it's crazy. You'll see like the person standing next to it, and they're sort of like dwarfed by this massive lens. But they only built, I think, like 5 of those, and before they figured it wasn't really that workable. No other questions? Well, I thank you guys. You have been a wonderful audience.